Welcome, everyone. This is Margaret Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter-Swan Society, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Swan Central, Harriman State Park of Idaho, and the surrounding area. Just a couple of housekeeping details. The webinar is being recorded, and if you registered for the webinar, you will get a link to the recording in a few days. You are muted as participant and your video is turned off. And we do welcome questions. So please submit them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. So thank you for that. Before we get started, I want to introduce a couple people behind the scenes from the Trumpeter-Swan Society that will be helping us out. Jim Hawkins and Jeff Nelson. And if you came to the webinar last month for the Yukon, Jim Hawkins was one of our presenters for that. And he will be looking through the question and answer box to see what questions you're putting in, so he can ask those at the end of the webinar. And Jeff Nelson is the president of our board of directors for the Trumpeter-Swan Society. And Jeff, would you like to say a few words about what the Trumpeter-Swan Society does, please?
Sure. Thanks, Margaret. And I want to thank everyone for attending today. I'm sure some of you have been on some of the other ones, and they've been really, really good educational opportunities for everyone involved. The Trumpeter-Swan Society has been around since the 60s. It's a small group, very active board members, and a group of dedicated supporters. And what we really focused on is trying to restore trumpeters throughout their historic range. As you know, they really were decimated during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and really starting in the 60s and into the 70s and 80s. It's been a focused effort to try to recover populations across as much as their breeding habitat, their historic habitat as possible. So we do that kind of work. We also fund research. We do some outreach along the lines of making films and videos and things like that. We work on education with kids and coloring books and some programs like that. And we also are tracking what's going on with swans in terms of power line mortality and lead poisoning, and take an active role in terms of advocacy when laws are proposed that might help the swans out. So today is a good example of what we like to see, and this is really a webinar that's going to focus on one of the important areas for swans in the Rocky Mountains. And we like to highlight some of the areas that our partners are working on, that they manage and bring people into, that are important to swans and where you can see swans if you go out there. So again, thank you for attending, and I'm looking forward to the seminar and any questions you might have with the speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Before we get started, I just want to let you see where Idaho is. Here it is right here, and it's near Wyoming and Montana. And the area that we're going to be talking about today is Harriman State Park, and it's in Fremont County right here, and Yellowstone National Park is over there. So that's where we're situated for today's webinar. So Jeff Snyder, would you like to take it away and maybe just give a little bit of background about yourself as well? And any questions you have, just please put them in the question and answer box. We're not going to be answering questions if people raise their hands or that kind of thing. It would be great. Thank you. Jeff?
All right. Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate the time. And again, welcome everybody to the presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Learn a great deal about the Rocky Mountain population today. So our frame of reference here is going to be in the Rocky Mountain population, or the RMP, for trumpeter swans. And primarily, we're going to be focusing on their major wintering area today. And just as a quick review, the Rocky Mountain population, or their wintering area, is composed of two groups of trumpeter swans. The first one is referred to as the greater Yellowstone flock, and this has been characterized as composed of year-round residents. And Margaret is using the cursor, so she's showing you exactly where they are. And then during the winter, they're joined by the Canadian breeding segment, and these are composed of individuals in Alberta and Northwest Territories and the Yukon and parts of British Columbia. And so those individuals will then during the winter or during the fall and winter will come down and migrate down into the Yellowstone area. And one of their primary wintering grounds is the Henry's Fork Wintering Ground at Harriman State Park of Idaho. Next slide. And again, this is just sort of a quick repeat. And as we go through this and we talk about some of the history and some of the events that occurred during the 1988-89 winter, it's instructive to understand where this occurred, what happened back then, so we can put in context what is going on today. So always try to remember that the RMP is composed of these two groups, and they're going to mix and mingle during the wintertime. Next slide. And again, history and context mean a lot. On the left, you're going to see a picture that was taken from a waterfowl book that was published in the 1970s. And you can see in the legend down below in the lower left, the words are probable, okay? And this is also showing these dark circles. And this was current breeding area and areas where at that time, and this was during the 1960s and 70s, some of the likely areas where we were finding trumpeter swans. Again, back then, the trumpeter swan numbers and where they were found was not what you see today. The picture on the right is a more current view, and this was based on an online map that was generated. And you can see that if you compare the two, they are starkly different. And since the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and even in the 90s, you can see that the numbers of swans have increased dramatically, as well as where they are found. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through this. Next slide, please. So where does Harriman State Park fit into this? And again, we have to have a little lesson in geography because we need to understand, again, that is composed of these two groups. One is composed of year-round residents and the other ones migrate in. And you can see by this big dark dot that I put there that Harriman State Park, the Henry's Fork wintering area within the park, is close to known areas around Yellowstone National Park. And if you look at that dashed line right above that dot, that's the Idaho-Montana border. And right above that borderline is Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. And that's for a swan, that's a short, just hop over the Centennial Mountains and you're down in Harriman and the Henry's Fork. And so you've got all these areas where trumpeter swans tended to congregate and overwinter. Next slide. So what is it about Harriman? What makes Harriman very important? And you have to remember that this portion, it's a 12-mile stretch as it flows through Harriman State Park of Idaho, is a relatively slow, it's relatively shallow. I'll show you some pictures of what it's like to do work in the river. And it has many species of plants, what I call swan food. And there are about 8 species there. And during the wintertime, when the swans congregate on the river, Henry's Fork of the Snake River, they are feeding on that. And they are also close by 2 lakes within the park that are also part of the wintering area, but also they serve as breeding areas. And as Kyle will tell you, places for other kinds of trumpeter swans to be there. And so Harriman is very unique. It has a unique stretch of the Henry's Fork, and they have swans nesting there as well as swans wintering there. So go ahead. One of the reasons is that this park used to be what they called a railroad ranch. And when it was gifted to the state of Idaho, it was declared a bird sanctuary. It was a wildlife refuge as well as a state park. And this made it very unique within the state Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation's system. And during this time, during the 70s and the 80s, this had one of the largest concentrations of wintering swans in the lower 48 states. And one of the unique things that the park staff did at that time was to initiate what they called swan surveys during the winter, November through March. And when they did those surveys, they started to find an ever-increasing number of trumpeter swans overwintering on the Henry's Fork. Next slide. And these are pictures of some of the historic buildings at Harriman. And these were used primarily for the owners of the railroad ranch. And if you look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, and you look at that big building there on the left, that is called the Jones House. This was built in 1955, and it was actually used as one of the first survey locations for the swan surveys there in the winter. The old assistant manager used to climb up to the top of on the roof and set up his scope right next to the chimney, and you can see how close that house is to a portion of the Henry's Fork, and it made it an ideal location to do trumpeter swan surveys at that time. And you can also, if you look at the picture in the lower right, this gives you a glimpse of what it looks like in the wintertime. Next slide. And one critical factor that I think is important as we tell this story of what happened during the 1988-89 winter is the effect of a nearby upstream dam. It's called the Island Park Dam, and it regulates the flow through Henry's Fork of the Snake River and through the Harriman State Park wintering ground. It's only 8 to 10 miles above, so it has a tremendous effect on the availability of swan foods during the wintertime. And so as we talk about some of the things that happened, what led to the events of 1988-89, we need to take this into consideration. Next slide. So in the 1970s, 80s, and the early 90s, swan surveys started to show that there was an ever-increasing number of swans. We would see them in various sections. And so in the early 80s and the late 80s, there started to be a set of conditions that were not very favorable to trumpeter swans there, because when the Island Park Dam tends to reduce the flow during the wintertime, that means less water flowing through the wintering ground, and that can result in combination with low temperatures and result in the formation of ice, and that ice can affect where the swans feed. Next slide. And so the winter of 1988 and 89 was not a very good year for trumpeter swans at Harriman State Park. It was, as a graduate student there, it was not one of the best things that I like to do, but there was drought in there. There was an extended drought. The Island Park Dam was storing water, and as a result, less was being released, so there were low flows. You're talking about 65 cubic feet per second, which is not a lot of water coming out. And in addition, during the 1988-89 winter, during December and January and February, most of those days had sub-zero temperatures. And when that happened, it was the combination of low flows and sub-zero temperatures that led to ice formation that prevented swans from feeding in those critical feeding areas with those swan foods. And so as a result, swans started to not be able to feed, they lost weight, and subsequently they died. And between 4 February and 25 April of 1989, I collected 25 swan carcasses in that wintering area. And you can see that there's a picture on the left-hand side. It shows some collars, and that helps us understand where these birds come from. These are collars from the Canadian segment. Next slide, please. So during that 1988-89 winter, if you can see the statements down in the lower left-hand corner, 94% of the wintering ground froze due to low river flows and sub-zero temperatures. And this ice restricted swans from feeding on that necessary swan food. And during this time in late January, the lowest temperature was minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can also see, if you look at the picture on the far right, not only do you have the red collars, but you also see the yellow collars. And attached to it on the left is one of the early radio transmitters. And these were birds that were from the Yukon. Len Shandrock up at the Canadian Wildlife Service was doing this project at the time. So what you see here is a unique combination of bad things. And this sparked national attention and a effort by local and regional and national natural resource agencies to try to save these birds. So there was newspaper, television, magazine coverage that stretched from coast to coast, and this raised the awareness of their plight. And these state and federal natural resource agencies initiated programs to capture swans at Harriman and move them to potentially new migratory areas further south. And this is where Gary comes in. So Gary, go ahead and take it away.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about the movements of swans out of Harriman State Park after that crisis and how it impacted our swans here in Eastern Oregon. This photo here in the slide is Summer Lake Wildlife Area. It was on February 3rd, 1989. It was 32 below at Malheur Refuge, which is a big refuge in Eastern Oregon that had, at that time, our count was 38 trumpeter swans on the refuge, a small resident flock that did not migrate. After that harsh winter, that next spring, we were down to 18. So we lost about half our flock because of that harsh cold winter just at Malheur. And because of that, we were pushing for trying to connect the Malheur flock to Summer Lake Wildlife Area, which is about 100 miles west. And Summer Lake has great wintering habitat because it's spring fed and lots of open water. I was there at Summer Lake on that same day that when it was 32 below at Malheur, it was about this cold at Summer Lake, and we counted 1,500 swans on the wildlife area. And this photo has 5 trumpeter swans in it, which was the only trumpeters we could find in that large flock. So there are very few trumpeters using sites other than Malheur Refuge in Eastern Oregon back in the late 80s, early 90s. We got involved in 1991. Slide. So the Pacific Flyway approved and funded the 5-year program to translocate birds out of Harriman to lower elevations, warmer sites to expand their wintering range, and birds were moved to Summer Lake, which is one of the priority sites because of controversies, but they're also moved down to Fort Hall Indian Reservation and Bruno Dunes on the Snake River. A few were moved to Utah and the Green River in Wyoming. They captured in those years about 2,000 trumpeters and moved them, trying to get them to imprint on new wintering sites. Next. And Rod Druin led that capture effort, and his wife, Ruth Shea, wrote a report in 1999, and they concluded that this project was basically not very successful. All the translated located swans basically did not pioneer much into new areas. Pretty much the adults returned to their old behaviors, and a lot of the juveniles that were moved were never seen again. So they basically said it was not a great decision at the time. I think they spoke too soon. Next slide. Also in the 1990s, a lot of the swan biologists believed in the theory that the greater Yellowstone trumpeter swans were genetically programmed to not migrate, basically, as opposed to the Pacific Coast trumpeters that migrate mostly from Alaska down to Southwest Washington. But in my experience, this doesn't seem to be the case. They weren't not necessarily genetically programmed. Rather, their reluctance to migrate to warmer areas is because swans learn their routes and wintering sites from their parents and tend to imprint on these sites and return them for their lifetime. They're very loyal to winter sites. I talk about for swans and cranes and even geese, there's this a flock knowledge. There's birds in the flock that know where to go, and they lead the other birds in those flocks. In 1991, we started moving some of the cygnets from Malheur. We got 26 cygnets from Red Rock Lakes because they were going to stop feeding that next winter that came to Summer Lake. And this just shows what those cygnets did without their parents. We had 3 of our Malheur cygnets that were a brood flew down to Death Valley for the winter and came back to Summer Lake in spring migration. We had birds up in Canada, as you can see, and also back in the greater Yellowstone area, Western Washington, and several places in Oregon. So they can move and quite capable of exploring and pioneering if they aren't with their parents. Next slide. So between 91 and 95, 585 trumpeters were moved to Summer Lake Wildlife Area in Oregon. Next. We had one female, which was a cygnet. And as I said before, most of the cygnets disappeared, but this female, 04H, was her neck collar, moved to Summer Lake in 1994. In 95, she was seen at Hebgen Lake in Montana in November. 97, she was at Yellowstone National Park in November. 98, she was on Big Bend of the Henry's Fork River at Harriman State Park in December. And then 99, she showed up at Summer Lake Wildlife Area with 4 cygnets. And then in 2000, 3 cygnets, 2001, 3 cygnets, 2002, 1 cygnet, and so on. In 2005, she stopped briefly at Ladd Marsh Wildlife Area in Northeast Oregon before moving down to Summer Lake. And she was seen there, she had 4 cygnets. We didn't see her in 2007, but every year she brought cygnets for those years. And we have recorded a total of 44 young swans that she brought to Summer Lake. And all of these birds had learned that migration route from her. And some of those older cygnets, and probably all of them now, if they're still alive, likely paired and raised broods of their own, which they brought down and kind of exponentially increased this movement into Oregon. Next slide. So our counts at Summer Lake, we do a count in early February, started in 2009 of trumpeter swans, and usually there's about a couple, 2,000 or 3,000 tundra swans there as well. So it's a little bit difficult to get them all categorized. Some of the birds are too far, but we usually classify about 60% of the swans. And you can see our counts are going up. Our peak was 2019. We had 435 swans counted, but again, you could probably add about 40% of that. So my take on this is there's about 1,000 trumpeters now moving through Eastern Oregon. And also we have data from Malheur Refuge in December this year. The biologists there counted 224 trumpeters on Malheur Refuge moving through. So things have changed. Next slide. This is my last slide, but this just shows the weekly counts at Summer Lake over time. You can see in the early 90s, the numbers are a little higher and then they go down, but that's because of the translocated swans there in the early 90s. But it's been going up and pretty much a strong increasing trend. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I'd like to take everybody back to Harriman a little bit and talk about a subject that was an important part of my research there. When I was doing the swan surveys, I started doing the swan surveys in the winter of 1984-85, and that continued all the way until the 1988-89 winter. But the last few years were also where I conducted some research on the Henry's Fork in terms of trying to identify areas and plants that swans tended to prefer. And for the sake of this, again, as we go through this, water plants are swan foods. And you can see on this stretch of the Henry's Fork how the flow is very smooth. And if you look at the 2 students I have in the center of the river, they're up to their thighs. And that's what I mean when I say this is a unique stretch of the Harriman, of the Henry's Fork, because it's relatively shallow, and you could walk from side to side on these areas, some of these areas, and it's rich with swan food and aquatic plants. But which ones are important? And all water plants are not equal when it comes to swans. So next slide. There are some species that the birds in the research tended to stay away from. And this was one of them, which was water milfoil. But there were also some species that they tended to show preference to. And in the analysis, we started to see a species called horned pondweed, which seemed to be showing preference, as well as a couple of others. The first one is going to be sago pondweed, and pondweed sago is very good because even though its stems will break off during the winter part, they will leave behind in the river substrate what we call tubers. And those tubers are very rich in carbohydrates, and that's energy for the swans. And so they would feed in these feeding areas by dipping their bodies, churning up the sediment, and then putting their head and neck down in there to stir it up and dig for those tubers. And another species that was important for them that the analysis showed was Elodea. And although it doesn't have tubers, it's rich in energy and certain types of nutrients which help this. Next slide. And so what we see here, yeah, thank you, Margaret. Migration for these birds is energy intensive. It requires a lot of energy. And over the course of the winter, swans will lose weight. But the degree to which they lose weight can be offset just a little bit by trying to eat a lot of foods and a lot of energies. And so during fall migration, they will feed on carbohydrates and protein. They will eat insects as they are available. During the wintertime, when they are at Harriman and the Henry's Fork, they will feed on those species, horn pondweed, sago, and particularly those little tubers that are in the river substrate, as well as insects that happen to be floating up to the surface. And one of the original researchers was Paul Hampton at Harriman, and he was able to look at some of the stomach contents of some of these birds, and he was able to show that this is exactly what they're doing. And then in the spring, swans, particularly females, are really trying to build up their energy stores for nesting. And so they would consume more carbohydrates, protein, and calcium. So where are those areas? So next slide, please. If we look at this aerial photo of Harriman and the Henry's Fork, you can see the direction of flow from the top right-hand corner as it flows through. And you can see that in those areas, in that 12-mile stretch, there are specific areas that I found that were very rich in swan foods and that the trumpeter swans tended to congregate, particularly these family groups. Next slide. So the area of what we call Big Bend has a large quantity of swan foods. It has a very open and wide area. That was where that photograph was taken. And so swans, and particularly swan families, were found in higher proportions in this area, and they tended to focus on feeding on those particular species. Now, if you go down to the far end or the southern part, you can see that there is also an area that has those same characteristics, and we would find swans there. And in the middle of this wintering area, you would find areas that have small rapids and riffles. And in comparison to the number of swans that we found in Big Bend or at the end of the wintering ground, there weren't as many swans in these small rapids and areas. And then also just above the end, we would find spring-fed areas, and these were traditionally a lot deeper, and they tended to stay open. So when the wintering ground was 94% ice, that 6% was down in those springs, and that's where we saw some of those birds. Next slide. So sort of in a summary, those river areas upstream are very important for feeding. And when ice formed in 1988-89, the birds did not have access to these plants. No energy, no food, they lost weight, and they subsequently died. And at the end of the wintering ground, it's also a very important area. It has a lot of the same characteristics as the area up around Big Bend, okay? And I'll skip down to the end, but near the end of the wintering ground, that channel again deepened, and it was spring-fed, and that allowed the birds to stay into open water. Okay, that's up for me. I think now we have what Margaret has asked me to show is what I call my top 10 reasons to visit Harriman State Park. And you can clearly see that it's going to be sort of picture-oriented, and it's going to be swan-centric. So here are the top 10 reasons. So next slide. Number 10, you get to admire the Tetons from the Jones house. In the evening, you can take a short trip over to see Mesa Falls. It's a beautiful area. During the wintertime, you can cross-country ski next to the Silver Lake Inlet. Hopefully you, like I did, was able to see a couple of beautiful swans in the wintertime. A walk around the historic Harriman buildings and admiring the fall colors is always a good time. So basically, anytime you go to Harriman, it's a good day. Swan listening and bald eagle watching on Silver Lake at sunset. Warm apple cider and swan watching in the Jones house. Listening to elk bugle in the morning and watching the fog lift off the Henry's Fork. It's a very quiet, lots of solitude down there. And in the fall, you get to enjoy the fall swan arrival at the Henry's Fork. And then finally, what I consider sums it all up, just seeing trumpeters in the park. Any day's a good day to see a trumpeter at Harriman. And so for that, I think, Kyle, it's up to you now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Babbitt. I am the interpretive ranger at Harriman State Park of Idaho. And so now we've talked about places, what's been happening. First off, I want to thank Margaret and the TrumpeterSwansociety for putting on this webinar about Harriman State Park swans in the Northwest area. And I want to thank Jeff for going through the background on the swans and what they're eating and why Harriman is so special. And then, of course, Gary, thanks for the Oregon connection, parts I didn't even know about. And so again, why not come? So first, if you're going to Google and come to Harriman State Park, you need to Google Harriman State Park of Idaho. Otherwise, you're going to be wandering around New York State looking for Harriman State Park, which is in New York along the Hudson River, but it's going to look very different from here. We often get phone calls that say, how far are you from Long Island? And I answer 2,534 miles. And you get this silence and it's like, this is Harriman State Park of Idaho. And so there's great places to do out there, but first make sure you're in the right place. Next slide. So we're going to start out with what are things to do and kind of review again what things are around Harriman State Park that you can do. You also want to make sure that you're looking up the weather before you travel. Even though well, we still have 4 feet of snow on the ground and there's a chance of snow this weekend. I heard that it was supposed to be spring, but it's 50 degrees out today, but you just never know. So if you're traveling in the winter, keep that in mind. Next slide. So this is a map of the area. It basically is in the middle there is the star, is where Harriman State Park is. And so from there, this is about a 2-hour radius around. So within an hour's distance, you can get up to Yellowstone National Park. And so we're right on Idaho is right on that corner of the map. You can go about an hour and a half or about an hour to the Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge. You can also go to the south to Camas National Wildlife Refuge. And then traveling down the Henry's Fork and Highway 20 follows the highway down to Idaho Falls. And in the wintertime, you can see a lot of swans along the river in different communities along the way. Again, that was that discussion of moving the swans, not just at Harriman, but they were also moved to the south, down the Henry's Fork. And so those seem to have done well. And so there's now a bigger population in the winter, not just at Harriman, but in this region. And even going to the southeast, you get down to Jackson, which is about a 2-hour drive. And on your way there in the wintertime, there also are some on your way as you pass through Driggs. And so Grand Teton National Park, of course, is your access point from Jackson. So airports nearby, New York one, Bozeman to the north is about 2 hours. Idaho Falls is about an hour and a half to the south. Salt Lake City is about 5 hours. So that kind of gives you your context of where things are located in this area. Next. So there's all sorts of maps of this area. The Greater Yellowstone Watchable Wildlife Group has picked wildlife sites in this area. So you can see that Harriman is on the map there. And we'll talk about Brig Springs. And there's different maps in the area that you can get more information at the Harriman State Park's Visitor Center and lobby. Go ahead. There's also a geotourism map guide by National Geographic that you can pick up. You used to be able to get them on the geotourism map guide section of National Geographic. I'm not sure they're still available online, but you can get them still at the park. We get boxes of them to give to visitors. It's one of the few maps that actually covers Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming on one big, like 4-foot map. So it's almost as tall as you are, with information about the area and what some of the special places are that you can come and visit, including Harriman and the places around here. So that's a great map to have, and we have those available. Go ahead. So this map in this area tells you, yeah, there's tons to do if you come out here. Not only seeing swans, the city of Island Park goes from Harriman State Park at the bottom of this map all the way up to Henry's Lake. And it's the longest main street in America. It's our claim to fame. It is about a 32-mile stretch that the city itself is technically 32 miles long and 1,000 feet wide. And wrapped around that is also the Island Park area that is in the county, but has all sorts of special places to go. So again, you can go cross-country skiing along the Buffalo River to look for swans besides at Harriman. In the summertime, you can go see Big Springs. Henry's Lake State Park is at that upper end, which has camping. They do have some nesting swans there in the summertime. You can access the Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge going past the southern end of Henry's Lake to get over into Montana. You can go down to Mesa Falls. To the south of us, we also run Ashton Teutonia Trail, which is a 32-mile linear park that goes from Ashton to Teutonia, which is a biking, hiking, non-motorized trail that you can see the countryside. Camas National Wildlife Refuge, and of course the Henry's Fork, as we mentioned, it goes all the way down to Idaho Falls and beyond. The Henry's Fork is basically the North Fork of the river. The South Fork comes out of Jackson area. They call it the Henry's Fork in Wyoming, and then it hits Idaho and becomes the South Fork. And they merge at about Rexburg. And that down there also gets you onto Mud Lake and other places that are bird sanctuaries. So next one. So again, the one on the left is skiing along the Buffalo River to look for swans and ducks and geese. In the middle is Big Springs and the Johnny Sack Cabin. That water is a major water source. Spring that comes up out of the ground and adds into the water flow into the Henry's Fork. And of course, as we said, Yellowstone National Park is only about 45 minutes away to the west entrance. In the summertime, you can access the park by road. Of course, in the wintertime, it's over the snow transportation only. So that map that I showed you right before is a summer map. That main corridor of the Henry's Highway 20 is your main route through the area. Most of those side roads become snowmobile routes. So you do have to be careful of traveling in the area in the winter and accessing the same places that you can see in the summer. Go ahead. Next. There we go. So now I'm going to take you on a tour of Harriman State Park itself. Became a park in 1977 and it opened in 1982. The Harrimans were working with the state to form this and to give this as a gift deed. And part of those things we'll talk along the way, but Jeff mentioned that they made parts of it a bird sanctuary. It's part of a bigger wildlife refuge with national forest lands. besides being an 11,000 acre state park with 24 miles of trails to go on. And so it opened in 1982 as a park. The Jones House was its first visitor center. And so when Jeff was here for that research, and some of that was done before it was opened as a park to continue that concern with the swans and find out more about them, and then also to find out more information about the area. So again, here's a list of all the things that you can do in the summertime. You can look for swans and go hiking and horseback riding, fly fishing in the Henry's Fork, going on historic tours. And then we're also open in the winter for fat tire biking, snowshoeing, skiing that are groomed trails. We have a gift shop that's in that visitor center, and we're open all year round. So we're going to take a brief tour around Harriman State Park just to find out more about those places and how they're currently used. And so this map has on it that has all the mileage on there. So those numbers are intersections, and those in the spaces in between give you the distances from place to place. And so the main thing to remember out of this, as I go through these, is to stop at the visitor center. So if you can find the visitor center, you can find all the maps that I mentioned. You can find out more information. We tend to not only give you information about Harriman, but the whole area. And so that's the key thing, is if you can find the visitor center, we can get you going in all different directions. Go ahead. So there's a view from the visitor center coming in. So we can see sunrises and sunsets. Next. So then from that visitor center, we have 1 mile of road. That's the gray line up the middle there, ending at the Ranch View shelter and parking lot. In that parking lot, we have some picnic areas. Under that shelter is used for programming and for places to sit. And also that gives you access to that little building at the top is our current horse barn, and where our horse riding goes with a concessionaire to visit the park. We've got 1 mile of road, and then again, the 24 miles of trails that go around about that. And so as we get to that road, we're going up to our historic buildings. You can stay in some of the historic buildings. So that lower left-hand circle is a blow up of what they call the Railroad Ranch. And that's the historic district that's on the National Registry. The houses are those little squares facing the river, are where the Harrimans and the Guggenheims and the Joneses would come and stay. And those are part of visiting tour houses. Those other blocks are actually some of the other historic buildings where it was a working ranch, and you can rent some of those. So you can come and stay overnight in those historic buildings all year long. And you can also stay in some yurts that we have that you can drive to near the visitor center. And there's even a backcountry yurt that you can hike in 1.5 miles to stay in the middle of the park, which is a really exceptional visit. So as you go up that path, perfect. You're going along the Henry's Fork, one of those special places to go fly fishing, to learn. There's a sign about the TrumpeterSwans. And part of that gift deed was to help protect the ducks and geese, and especially the swans. And so there's a delayed opening on those river trails and fly fishing, and until June 15th. The river is fly fishing only, catch and release, which means you have to have single barbless hooks. And that was all part of that gift deed. And you're walking up a paved walkway to go to that historic district. Next. The other end of that path was where the Jones House is the first house for your historic tours. That was the latest or newest building, I guess, that was built in 1955. The oldest are from 1902. And so you can learn again more about the Harrimans, the Guggenheims, and the Joneses, and why they too love to visit here in Idaho Fall Island Park and to visit this beautiful area. They came and stayed in really tiny houses because they wanted to be, as we want to do, out fly fishing, hiking. In their area, they were hunting, etc. The area now as that wildlife refuge is non-hunting and non-motorized right around the park. So we get to explore some more by going up the trails and getting on our way to Golden Lake in the fall to listen for elk bugling. Continuing. Next. Up to that Golden Lake area. Takes a while to get back there. It's a couple miles in, but this is where we are saying that the teenage swans hang out in the summertime. So in the summer, we'll talk about Silver Lake, but in this area of Golden Lake, it tends to be where they haven't paired up yet, and they'll go and have quite a number of them on that lake that you can go see out at Golden. Also on your way to Golden Lake and throughout the trails, multiple uses of seeing sandhill cranes are nesting, curlews. We get all sorts of different birds. We do have moose and elk and deer in the park, sometimes in our backyards, and then a variety of wildflowers throughout the summertime, including mule's deer, Wyathia, which is one of the names of one of our yurts. As you're coming back through, make sure that you stop by Silver Lake and look there again, and especially in the summertime, it's a bird sanctuary. And so we don't use it. It belongs to ducks and geese and swans who are out there nesting. And so this is a location that is one of the premium locations for trumpeter swans nesting. We've had up to 3 pairs there that have raised their young cygnets. So you can walk around it on the trails. From these different areas, you can see going upriver, that's called Hat Island, behind what they call Millionaire's Pool. That's the one behind the buildings, and great grays can even be seen in the park in the fall, early winter, and even on over to Harriman East to Osborne. And that's the picture to your far right. Go ahead. So we still get a lot of swans in the wintertime. This is actually just above that place where he was saying that the rapids are. So that Big Bend Loop area and the southern end are not really accessible in the winter. But if there's plenty of open water, then we'll have the swans right behind those historic buildings. So if you're in the Jones house on the weekends, you can view through those windows and see them through the spotting scopes or out and about on the trails. And so we still get 5 to 6 feet of snow in the wintertime. It can be -20, but it doesn't get to the -45s like it used to. So you can see that it can freeze over some, which is what the swans like. One of those key things that's happened is from when Jeff was there doing the studies to now, is that the Fremont-Madison Irrigation District, the Henry's Fork Foundation, Bureau of Reclamation, and others have really been working on water management. And the key has been winter water. And they found and done that key water for the trout in the Henry's Fork, which is a prime use of it. But that also helps the swans tremendously because that keeps the ice moving and gives them access to that food. And so when it's open waters, they're spread out that we can see them. When it gets really cold, as Jeff said, we don't see them because they've gone to those open spring areas where they have access. And we're almost on our way moving out of the park to the next slide so that we can wrap up that you can also go to Harriman East. There's an access point on the Osborne parking for fly fishing access. And then you can go up Highway 20 to the intersection with 47. That's your turnoff to get to the other side of Harriman East, which is mostly fly fishing access, and also gets you down to Mesa Falls. Go ahead. Next slide. So that you can access, there's not trails on this side of Harriman East, but there's a few access roads for fly fishing and birding and seeing that special area. And they go on down the road to Mesa Falls. Next slide. And journey on from there. They have a map that's coordinated. We run Mesa Falls with the Forest Service. And even on that map, it also gives you some distances, again, to the entrance of Yellowstone, 50 miles to the north, down to Idaho Falls at 70 miles to the south. So thank you for touring Harriman State Park with me. And we hope to get you out in this area sometime soon.
Great. Well, thank you, Kyle and Gary and Jeff. That was great. I know I learned a lot and appreciate everybody attending. And actually, we would welcome your questions if you have any. You can actually pick the people's brains here of, you know, what happened during that winter and what's going on at Harriman State Park. So if you put your questions and answers or questions in the question box, that would be great. And just a reminder as well as after the webinar ends, there'll be a little survey that'll pop up in your browser and it'll ask you, we just have like 5 questions and I want to know if you found anything interesting or new that you learned here. Any other topics that you would like to learn about that we could hold in a future webinar. And also down here at the bottom, you'll see the websites for the Trumpeter Swan Society as well as Harriman State Park. So you can actually get more information there. And I've been to Harriman several times and it's a great place to go. So I would certainly recommend it. It's very enjoyable. Jim, are there any questions that showed up?
Yeah, we have a few questions. Summer was wondering if the Jones House is going to be more accessible than it has, I guess, in the past. Is it still being used for employee housing? What's the status of that?
So it was open this winter as a warming hut on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. It's used as a tour house, also in the summertime. It is also used as employee housing who also help take care of the building. So yes, there's been more access to it this winter. We've been able to be in there.
Thank you. We also have a question, maybe this is for Gary. Have there been trumpeters found breeding in California? And if so, do we know if they're migratory or not?
Gary, you're muted. Gary, you're muted.
Oh, still not working, Gary. Damn.
No, can't hear you yet. Nope.
We're still not getting anything.
Nope.
Still
not.
nothing. Oh my gosh.
Well, the answer is no.
There we go. The answer is no. Good. Got that.
To clarify that, John Muir talked about his favorite birds of the Yosemite Sierra back in the 1850s, and there was the carunca, the crane, the caw, the Clark's crow, which is the nutcracker, and the trumpet of the swan. And on June 22nd, 1853, he reported a raft of swans at the mouth of the creek that feeds Mono Lake below Yosemite. And in the summertime, the only raft of swans you would have would be the teenage non-breeders hanging out in a flock. So there were trumpeters in California historically during this breeding season. There are a few records in Oregon. And in terms of if they were breeding in California, they likely would move out if it froze up. But we hope that someday they'll show up at Modoc Refuge. That's kind of the next step. There's a bunch of wetlands in Modoc National Forest and Lassen National Forest and those areas where and there's some wildlife refuges as well. We hope that the Oregon population, once it starts expanding, will breed in Northern California. I'm optimistic about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. We also had a question about lead poisoning. How did you mitigate lead poisoning in the past, I presume, in this area? And is there anything being done about it today?
Well, they don't use lead shot for fly fishing, so they've made other products that you don't have the lead poisoning in the river that's left behind that could get stirred up with the plants and bugs and things. That part I know.
You mean lead tackle, is that right? Lead tackle?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So was there a problem in the past or in this area or not?
Not that I know of.
Don't really know. Okay. All right. Sounds good. There's also a question. This is one from a photographer who's wondering if there is any restrictions on using things like a floating hide in any of these water bodies in the park.
I'm not sure what a floating hide is, Tracy.
It's a
but-
blind that you use
okay, but that you float along with. Well, it's It's navigable waters. It's during the season of June 15th to November 30th. The river is open. You can float through. I wouldn't be going through on June 15th when the river opens with all the fly fishing people that are out in the river when it's just opened up. But that's something to reach out to the park and to check on. I do know that drones are not allowed in the park because, again, of the wildlife refuge. But things like that, drift boats are allowed. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Kyle, and I think also you could speak to the idea of the restrictions on Silver and Golden Lake during the summer too.
Oh yeah, those lakes are not used at all. Again, they belong to the ducks and geese and swans, and so we can walk around them, but we don't even stick our toes in them. And so we can see those as nesting areas and things, but we don't use those two waterways or those two lakes. But at Henry's Lake, you can go in, you know, up at Henry's Lake with waterways and the reservoirs. And in the summertime, again, they're frozen over in the winter.
Thank you. And another interesting question about the effect of beavers in these wetlands. Do they have any effect on the amount of food that might be available for swans? And are trumpeters using beaver lodges for nesting in this area?
Kyle, do you want me to take a stab at it?
Take a stab and then I'll follow. Go ahead.
Okay. Most of the time, as Kyle said, and hopefully I said, some of the nesting areas were in Silver Lake, and usually those are on top of muskrat houses and mounds. And so the trumpeters readily use that. As far as beaver densities in this 12-mile stretch, there's not much that I know of. I only used to know of maybe one or two, but they were so small relative to the size of the Henry's Fort that they didn't have much of a what you might call a benefit. Silver and Golden Lakes are formed by dam structures. And so basically those areas are influenced mostly by the dam as opposed to any beaver dam.
Correct. And so there are some beaver and muskrats, and you're correct that they don't have lodges really in the middle. They've been on the shorelines. And so the nesting platforms that they're wanting out in the middle aren't there. But in Silver Lake, there's a couple islands that they're nesting on. So there's an expanse of islands that they're out on the northern end that they're on each end of. And then there had been some raised spots. I don't know if it was an old beaver lodge or not in the farthest southern part where we had a nesting pair. That spot has kind of flattened out, and so they've been using up around the corner. And there was some discussion whether that area might get some benefit by raising that corner of, you know, making a bigger mound for them.
And here's an interesting comment from someone who is Douglas, who has noticed that he's seen swans in the harvested potato fields along the Snake River corridor south of Harriman State Park, and wondering if they're looking for leftover potatoes. And I'm just going to jump in there quickly because I know this is one of their favorite foods on the Pacific Coast in the Vancouver, British Columbia area and further south into Washington State. So what their swans are feeding on there is what they call the volunteer potatoes, which are the potatoes that are too small to harvest and they're just left in the fields. And so the swans are getting in there and eating those, and the farmers are actually glad because that they don't really want the volunteer potatoes left in the ground. And so the swans come and it's a win-win situation. So anybody want to comment on that in this area?
Agreed. There are some that are leaving, as you said, those volunteer or the smaller seed potatoes. They've also been, the Henry's Fork Foundation and others have been working with some of those farmers again to do no-till and leaving some of the silage on the surface and some of those potatoes. And yes, they are eating some of the leftover potatoes and crops that are left behind.
Another question about water plants. Are there trumpeters? Is there evidence that the trumpeters are eating invasive or non-native water plants in any of these areas?
That's a very good question. That is something that I've been trying to do ever since I restarted my research there in 2011. To this day, I haven't seen any of those non-native species. They've been
Knock on wood.
I haven't seen them there. The Henry's Fork Foundation is always on the lookout for those non-native invasive species, but not the ones that I've seen at Harriman, at least hopefully not yet.
But too, you're raising milfoil at Malheur Refuge, which is invasive, exotic, and they do eat that.
Okay, we have just a couple of more questions here. We're getting close to the end. Are the trumpeters still broadening their range around this area through, in the recent past? Who wants to tackle that one? Anybody?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Harry, you want to take a stab at it?
Yes, it seems like there's increasing numbers showing up in Utah and also in Oregon. So I think that process is still going as the populations increase and raise more young. I think they're slowly spreading out from these new sites they've been using.
And I guess it's anecdotal that we're seeing them up and down the Henry's Fork further, where you'd only see them at Harriman. You are seeing them all the way down the rivers, Henry's Fork to Idaho Falls. Again, I think there's another question about American Falls that'll get answered, going over towards Driggs. So they do seem like they're spreading out in this area besides some other ranges.
Yeah, that brings up a question from Chris who says that they counted over 30 trumpeter swans at American Falls recently, and was wondering if those are relocated from somewhere else or have they been studied at all? Who wants to tackle that one?
Jeff, so weren't some moved to America? Wasn't that part of the
Oh, yeah.
discussion that some were moved to American Falls to begin with?
Yeah, to my knowledge, a lot of the translocation efforts resulted in a lot of swans in what we call the Fort Hall Bottoms, which is close to American Falls Reservoir, and then further south onto the reservoir, and then downstream of the reservoir. And then as the Snake River flows west, it's close to what we call Bruneau Dunes State Park. So yes.
And
And state parks in all those locations.
Yeah. Excuse me.
one last question here, and this is one I think that comes up quite often, is should a sighting of a neck-banded swan be reported, and where does someone find that information?
Okay, well, this is Margaret, and I'm going to answer that question. There are two places to report them. One is Trumpeter Swan Society actually has a Trumpeter Watch program. And so if you go to our website, Report a Swan, our easy to fill in form comes in. And when I get those, I review them and I know who banded those swans. And then I send that report to the bander so they have it. And if people upload pictures, they get that. They can see the condition of the collar and, the exact location and more information about what the swan is doing. And the other place that banders really want you to report to is the bird banding lab. And they're the keepers of all the bird banding for all migratory birds, all the bird banding information. And so they have a form that you fill out as well. And then that information goes to the bander as well. So definitely, if you see a collared swan or a leg banded swan, or if you're obviously in Ontario or whatever, you see a wing tag swan, do report those, because those are actually telling the story of that particular bird, because each mark is unique to that swan. And when the banders get the location of those swans, they know how old it is usually, they know where else it's been, and it's telling that story. So it's super important if you see one to report it. So either to the Trumpeter Watch program or to the bird banding lab.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time here. Margaret, do you have some parting comments? Or?
Well, again, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you signing up to participate and attend our webinars. It's very enjoyable for me to know that you all are learning more about swans, and what we're trying to do is tell the swan stories across North America, because it's such a fabulous and wonderful story. And I appreciate all the contributions by the speakers here as well. And again, you'll be seeing survey that'll pop up on your browser, and hopefully you will fill that in because your input is really important. And if you haven't received notices of our webinars through our e-newsletter, it'll ask if you want to sign up for that. So thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate that. And hopefully we'll see you next time. So thank you.